My name is Ty Menser. I'm Chair of the Board of County Commissioners, and I represent the county on the Climate Action Steering Committee and serve as Vice Chair of that committee. Tonight, I'm in the role of moderating the discussion. As a brief introduction, the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan is an ambitious, interjurisdictional plan to address the actions that contribute to climate change. The planning has been several years in the process, and earlier this year, phase 2 of the plan, which outlines 72 action areas for the community and local governments, was adopted by the Board of County Commissioners along with the resolution that declared climate change an emergency in Thurston County. County and cities are currently working on phase 3, which is a one-year process to develop a long-term intergovernmental agreement to address implementation and monitoring of the strategies developed in phase 2. That long-term implementation process is being called phase 4 and is expected to begin in mid-2022. More details about the specifics of the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan can be found on the TRPC, or that's Thurston Regional Planning Council website, trpc.org. Thurston County has thus far committed $300,000 toward implementation of the plan in its 2021 budget, committed an additional $37,500 toward creating an energy efficiency conversion program for buildings, developed a high-level county-specific implementation plan this year, and will be considering further staffing resources for implementation and climate-related work in its 2022 and 2023 budget discussions this fall. We also recently became the second county in Washington to enact a CPACER program, and that stands for Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy and Resiliency Program, which is a creative financing tool for energy efficiency upgrades in buildings and one of the elements of our climate mitigation plan. Tonight, we have 4 guests to provide information and answer questions about climate change and the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan specifically. Shelly Slaughter, Jenica Machado, Lisa Parsley, and Allison Osterberg. I intentionally did not say what each of their job titles is. Each of them has a unique role within the larger effort to locally address climate change. And I will ask each panelist to introduce themselves briefly and highlight how their work specifically fits in the region's efforts to address climate change. Let's start with Shelly Slaughter.
Good evening. My name is Shelly Slaughter, and I am Director of Thurston County Public Health and Social Services Department and Administrator of the Thurston County Board of Health. And climate change and the impacts have been a very important focus of our department for well over a decade. We are a member of the National Association of City and County Health Officials, and back in 2009, we received a grant to explore what the public health impacts of climate change would be on Thurston County residents. There's a white paper that is on our website that I encourage people to check out. And in addition, aside from our dedicated environmental health staff, our community education team, led by Chris Hawkins, has been instrumental in helping the county to advance climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. Our department was fortunate to be able to fund phase 1 and phase 2 of the climate mitigation plan, and we continue to work collaboratively with community members on the Thurston Thrives climate action team, as well as many others in our community and all the jurisdictions and many of you that are here joining us tonight. And we look forward to further partnering on this very important and dire issue in our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelly. Let's go to Jenica.
Hello, Jenica Machado, Economic Development Manager for Thurston County. I serve in the Commissioner's Office, and I'm currently engaged with climate work at Thurston County as we take steps to implement the Climate Mitigation Plan that was adopted earlier this year. I developed the climate spending overview and am the county representative participating on the climate multi-jurisdictional staff team. Thank you.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Hello, I'm Lisa Parsley. I started this journey as an Olympia City Council member, and in 2018 I was appointed by the City Council to join the Phase 2 process, which developed the plan. And in last year's 2020 fall, I was part of the subcommittee that helped develop phase 3. Currently, I am the Climate Action Steering Committee chair, and I'm one of the leads for climate action at the Olympia City. I work very intimately with our climate program manager, who just started in 2020 on the implementation for our city and what our lobbying priorities will be for 2022.
Thank you, Lisa. Allison?
Good evening. My name is Allison Osterberg, and I'm a senior planner with Thurston Regional Planning Council. Thurston Regional Planning Council, or TRPC, is a regional council of governments, and we bring people together to work on cross-boundary issues in our region. And that includes all the jurisdictions in Thurston County. And we were contracted with Thurston County and the cities of Lacey, Olympia, and Tumwater, contracted with TRPC to coordinate the development of the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan. And I help coordinate that work and am continuing to help coordinate some of the implementation of the plan in this year.
Thank you, Allison. The plan for this panel originally was to do it in person, but with the evolving situation with COVID-19, we couldn't do that safely. There still will be an opportunity for folks to submit questions through our chat, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. But first, I wanted to start with a question or two for each panelist regarding some questions that I hear when talking with people in our community. And then we'll open it up to folks to submit questions through chat. Start with Shelly. Shelly, as Thurston County's Public Health and Social Services Director, can you share in a general sense some of the health impacts climate change causes, both here locally and around the world?
Yes, thank you so much, Commissioner Menser, for that question. As I mentioned, Thurston County Public Health and Social Services has been greatly concerned about the impact of climate change on the health of our community for many, many years. And we are seeing that happen now. So I just want to review some of the health impacts that may not be so obvious to people when you're thinking about climate change. A lot of things come to mind in terms of the physical environment, but the impacts of climate change on the health and well-being of our community has long-term and very serious health impacts, including not only increasing current public health threats that we already have, but creating new ones that we have not experienced here in the Pacific Northwest or here in Thurston County for many years. So I'll start with heat-related events and the associated illness that people experience. So many of you may have on the top of your minds the summer that we just had and the extreme heat that was unlike anything that we have experienced in many of our lifetimes here in Thurston County. In the state of Washington, 138 people lost their lives due to the severe heat event that happened in June and July of this year. And in Thurston County, we lost 6 residents to heat-related illness that ended up dying. So things that people experience when there is high heat include things such as stroke, heat exhaustion, dehydration, even things like sunburn from exposure for people that can't escape it. That has been a huge concern for us and continues to be something that we will see. We also see the opposite in the upcoming winter months here, where we see extreme cold temperatures. This is especially hazardous to the health of our most vulnerable members of our community. So we have a hazardous weather task force that has activated more times in the last 3 years than has ever happened before in Thurston County. We've had a great number of hazardous weather events impacting our community in serious ways, including increasing hospitalizations, and pressure on our already overfull emergency departments, such as what we are experiencing now, and really exacerbating the problem that we already have with COVID-19 pandemic occurring. We also start to see things like increased wildfires. And we did have a major wildfire in Thurston County a couple of years ago, but we see those throughout the western region of our state, and we see the impacts of that impacting our Thurston County residents. Children, the elderly, those who work outdoors, youth that play sports, and all of us that want to be outside, being healthy and exercising and enjoying our beautiful parks and environment that we have here in Thurston County get impacted when the weather when the air quality is not safe for us to breathe, especially people with asthma, cardiac diseases, pulmonary illnesses. They are greatly impacted when our air quality really declines during things like wildfire smoke, which we are going to continue to see more of. We also see an increase with higher temperatures and environmental conditions such as increased precipitation and rain of vector and zoonotic diseases. So some of the increase in infectious diseases that we have seen and investigated in our public health department include illnesses such as Giardia, malaria, Campylobacter, Crypto, Salmonella, E. coli, Shigella. Many of these illnesses are created by climate change. So vector-borne illnesses such as mosquitoes, that mosquitoes can bring, that rodents can bring, such as hantavirus. When things like flooding happen, those pests increase, and we start to see that cross over and impact the health of our Thurston County residents. We have seen an increase in those illnesses here in our community. We also see when people recreate on our beautiful lakes and streams and that we have here in Thurston County, we've seen an increase in toxic algae blooms and other waterborne illnesses that cause things like severe diarrhea and illnesses that can lead to hospitalization and death. We've seen a 7.2 increase in respiratory hospitalization admissions here in the Northwest. We have also seen an increase in challenges with our food supply. That's also something that we really worry about. As the weather changes, that really can impact those that grow our food. And in Thurston County, we have lots of agricultural space here in our community that provides healthy, nutritious foods for us. And that can really impact access to healthy foods. We also see that there is a mental health impact on our community. They become more stressed by experiencing the impacts of climate change. We see socioeconomic stresses that occur as a result of people that are impacted by these events. So overall, we are seeing poor health outcomes, and that is a direct result of climate change that we are experiencing now. We are working hard with all of you and our members in our community who are dedicated to helping find ways that we can prevent this from happening, that we can mitigate these health impacts and ensure that the health of our community is protected from the impacts of climate change long term.
Thank you, Shelly. A lot of good information. Jenica, I'm going to turn to you. Impacts to economic development come up a lot when we discuss climate change. What are some of the economic challenges or opportunities presented by climate change, and how is the county and other communities around the country and world addressing those impacts? Big question.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to break that up into a few different sections. So first, like any disruptive force, climate change is creating opportunities for companies that are able and willing to innovate. It creates opportunities for new businesses, entrepreneurs. We can see growth opportunities in renewable energy. So like Olympia Community Solar had a very successful solarized Thurston group purchasing campaign. There'll be opportunities with green building, eco-friendly construction, climate smart financial solutions. So institutions creating credit lines to expand lending projects that will help businesses become more energy efficient. Also with our local ag, we really saw an increased concern that people had about their local food systems. And so with that additional attention, there can be growth that will support the local ag industry. Additionally, we'll see some potential new lines of work. And so in our climate mitigation plan, one of the items identified is the home energy scores. And so currently that's not a line of work that is available in the county, but this initiative could create additional jobs. I heard another piece of that question being, what are we doing locally? And I believe Commissioner Menser, you had already identified this, but CPACER. The Thurston County Commissioners did approve the Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy Resilience Financing Program. And that is the property-based debt financing and energy efficiency, renewable energy, water conservation projects. Also in the climate mitigation plan, there are a number of initiatives that are identified that address opportunities like permitting incentives and telecommuting infrastructure. And just to highlight some of the work that others are doing in our community, the Nisqually tribe is engaged in some exciting workforce development activities, partnering with Redline Training Academy. So what they're doing is they're providing workforce training and broadband infrastructure. And so that the more infrastructure workforce we have, the more infrastructure projects we have, the better we'll be able to provide fast and reliable and affordable broadband for our citizens within Thurston County. And then I feel like another piece of that question was we have some unique economic drivers here in Thurston County. And so I think Shelly had mentioned ag is a big one. And so with ag, this is a really important sector in our economy, and extreme weather events affect crop productivity. We may see flooding that kills livestock. And another kind of subsector of ag is shellfish. And so we have a strong shellfish industry here in our region, with shellfish being a large export that brings money back to our rural parts of our community. With ocean temperatures increasing, ocean acidification, extreme weather events like that big heat wave that we saw, this creates an environment where shellfish farmers lose crops and lose profits. Shellfish mortality is on the rise. And during that huge heat wave we had earlier, some farms saw 20 to 80% of their crops die. And so additionally, these changes create opportunities for pathogens, which increase diseases within the crops. And then they'll see a harvest restriction based on those pathogen levels. And so it's another way that their crops and profits are reduced. And then another piece just with the government side, if there's increased funding to support climate work, Thurston County being the seat of government could gain additional jobs in ecology or DNR. And so there are a few different levels in which we could see climate impacts and opportunities specific to Thurston County.
Thank you, Jenica. Appreciate that. Let's turn to Lisa. Lisa, what can the county as a community, including our cities and towns, do to address climate change? And I'm thinking both, at the governmental level, as well as what individuals can do to address climate change. And I know you and I have spoken to community groups about this, and it's always an interesting question that we get, what can I do? So can you kind of talk about that on both levels in terms of our mitigation plan?
Absolutely. Thank you. And by the way, I didn't say this when I introduced myself, but I want to thank Thurston County and the County Commission for hosting this, because these are the kinds of forums we absolutely need. And that is part of the answer. But I'm going to start with what can the jurisdictions do? And I have a great deal of pride in our 4 major jurisdictions because we've all made a commitment to climate change and mitigating climate change. Lacey just adopted the Climate Mitigation Plan into their comprehensive plan. Tumwater, Thurston County, and Olympia declared a climate emergency, which requires us to put a climate lens on all the things we do as jurisdictions. So we can act as an example. For example, looking at what our fleets are doing. Are we electric when we can with our cars? How are we doing our garbage collection? What are we doing to mow the lawns in our parks? How are we looking at our own buildings and electrifying them and getting alternative energy? For example, Olympia and I suspect a couple of the other jurisdictions are getting their entirety of their electricity through green direct through the Puget Sound Energy. So by an example, by saying that we think there's a climate emergency, we are putting a climate lens on everything we do and looking at the climate mitigation. But we also are beginning to look at what does it look like to incentivize the appropriate changes in our community, not just in the individuals, but in our commercial community through grants and revolving funds and cooperative purchasing. I just have heard of one that might be a fantastic one. We've all heard about electric vehicles, but what if we could get a cooperative purchasing for heat pumps for homes to be able to take us off fossil fuels? The other thing that the jurisdictions can do is we can work through legislation. Yes, sometimes we do have to legislate the change through zoning and codes so that we can make sure that our built environment is not as big of a footprint as it currently is, which is over 52% of our carbon footprint for our region. But also look at things like no net loss, like Jenica was talking about, of urban farms and our farms, because that's not only going to help us with reduced car trips of bringing food into Thurston County and the carbon cost of trucking it up from California and Mexico, but it's also going to help us with carbon sequestration, especially if we do regenerative farming. Lastly, if as a region we can come together and put our might together, because all of us are saying this, both to the state and to the federal government, we can push a priority at that level, because some of the actions in our climate plan are going to have to come from the state and the federal government, because we won't be able to necessarily do that. But as a region, we can come forward and tell the state and our federal representatives, these are very important things. Now, as a person in our community, and I get this all the time, and this is an excellent question, what can I do as a person? I'm going to tell you a little story that hopefully is an antidote to what I think you all should do. I was attending a climate action steering committee thinking about what can we do to get the community members to be part of our climate plan. And I realized that I had just gotten in my car and driven in 1.5 miles to work to get on the Zoom. I can walk 1.5 miles. I can get out of my car. My dogs get exercise. I get exercise. I'm less stressed when I get to work. So I would encourage people to look at the simple things. If my store is 1 mile away and I just need to pick up a few groceries, not the month of shopping, but something for dinner, get out of the car. When you leave the building and you're going to work, make sure all your lights are off. Make sure you run and maybe do your dishes during the day when it's not going to be as big impact on our grid system, so that maybe we can get to solar. Look at what solar would cost in your own home. When you're getting ready to buy a new car, look at electric vehicles. But I've also seen downtown a huge bloom in electric bikes. Look at electric bikes. Olympia is going to start looking at what does it look like to have a bike rack with a plug-in, not just for cars, but for electric bikes. Get on the bus. So take a moment to go, okay, it can't be life as usual, because life as usual has gotten us into this mess. Maybe I'm going to buy from the farmer's market or get into a CSA for the farming. Maybe I am going to get an electric vehicle. And when I leave to go to work, I'm either going to get in a car, turn on my computer and work virtually, and I'm going to turn off the lights when I leave? Simple things like that can make a huge difference.
Thank you, Lisa. Don't forget that inner city transit is zero fare, so can make a big difference. I'm going to go to Allison. Allison, as Lisa kind of alluded to there are strategies listed in our climate mitigation plan that need to occur at both local and state levels, federal as well, but looking at the state overlaps, can you kind of highlight for us where there are overlaps and how the plan manages those overlaps and breaks things down?
Sure. One of our real takeaways from developing the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan was I think we gained a better understanding about how important the state would be as a partner for us going forward. We need the state to take action in areas where locally we don't have authority. So some things we talked about are, how are we going to fund climate work? In many cases, there are rules in the way local governments can collect funding, and those are managed at the state level. So we would need the state to say either to create funding or to give us the authority to use funding authority we have. The CPACER program is a great example of that. That was the state legislation. They needed to change something at the state level, and Thurston County was among many jurisdictions saying this is something we'd like to do. And once the state took that action, Thurston County could step up and authorize this program to take place in the county. That also applies for things like the way property taxes are collected, the way standards in buildings are developed. Often these things are set, things like real estate transactions. There are a lot of rules around this that are for good reason are set at the state level, so they're consistent in different places. And so we've identified some things in our plan. There are things we may want to ask at the state level for those changes. We also need the state to help us to fund the type of work that we want to do. We can identify good ideas, and there are lots of great programs at the state in energy and in forests and in agriculture, or if we have a good idea, they have a pot of money that's devoted to that. We can say we want to use it for this type of activity. And the state can set standards and provide guidance that can carry a weight that allows for more consistency across the state. And sometimes it takes local governments to lead on those and provide a good example that then get adopted and used other places. So we can rely on the state to learn from things. And another point, and Jenica brought this up, is that the state is not just we're unique in Thurston County because we're the state capital, and the state is actually one of our major employers, one of our major energy users. A lot of people driving, commuting to work, or going from meetings are working for the state to do that or tied to that. And so the state can also help in addressing their own carbon footprint, because that's a big part of our regional carbon footprint. And but it's a partnership, right? So the state also needs us to help to achieve, we need us to let them know what we need to achieve our climate goals. The state has climate goals that are for reducing greenhouse gas emissions that are also very ambitious. But there are things that we can do locally to support both of our targets. So as part of the climate mitigation plan, there's been a lot of recent state legislation that helps it's addressing the state's targets for greenhouse gas emissions. And so we looked at the impact on some of those. So one, for example, is the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which passed a few years ago, which will require electric utilities in the state to phase out coal by 2025 and get 100% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2045. That's going to have a huge impact on our ability to meet our climate targets, because right now our largest source of emissions is from electricity use in buildings. So if that's coming from 100% from renewable sources by 2045, wow, that's just gets us so much farther to our goal line. But it's not a magic switch, right? That's going to be a big lift statewide. And so what we can do locally to support a state action like the Clean Energy Transformation Act is reduce how much energy we're demanding locally by becoming more energy efficient. We can do things like working locally to permit things that are going to support that transition. So permitting, making sure it's easy to do energy efficiency improvements, install renewable energy technology like solar panels, so that can happen relatively quickly. And we can also, our important role, and Lisa touched on this, is telling our legislators what we need, because local governments are kind of the eyes on the ground of what's happening, what's working and what's not, and what we might need to see these changes happen that are policies that are set at the state level. So in the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan, we identified over 70 actions, and we thought about what the next logical step would be, who might need to start working on them. And there were a number of actions we identified that we could get to right away locally. And there were some actions we said we wanted to work on together regionally. And there were some where we thought we might need to ask the state for help, either by asking for some new kind of authority or asking them to set some kind of new standard. And so that's the way we broke it out in the plan.
Thank you, Allison. That's a good breakdown. And just to kind of adding on to your comment there, it seems like what I understood is that the Clean Energy Transformation Act, if those goals are hit, puts a lot of the local focus on transportation as being the remaining sector that will have more local control over. And so that's something that occurred right in the middle of the planning process for phase 2. So we're all kind of working on this together and having to be flexible and pivot as the moving parts change.
It's true. And it's also, since we've adopted the plan, that it is constantly, there's a lot of action that's happening, including at the state level. There's a lot of legislation that passed this most recent session that could have a huge impact on our ability to meet our goals. The state passed a clean fuel standard. They passed a new electric vehicle or zero emission vehicle preparedness standards. They passed legislation around hydrofluorocarbons. And kind of a real big one is the Climate Commitment Act will establish a comprehensive cap and invest system. And that invest part could be for projects in Thurston County. So again, it could be not just setting a cap on carbon emissions. There is potentially money coming through the state that can help fund the type of work we want to see for climate mitigation.
All right, good. So before jumping into our open Q&A, just a few ground rules. I'll be reading questions submitted through the chat box. So that'll be the place to submit the questions, through the chat box. Either I'll be reading them. I may call on Brian, our public information officer for Thurston County, to add questions because he's going to be helping me monitor depending how many come in. Tonight's conversation is centered on climate change and mitigation efforts. So please keep your questions focused on that area as best you can. Questions, on related or unrelated topics or tangentially related topics won't be addressed. Be respectful of others in our panelists. And I'm going to start off with just a couple of questions that were submitted in advance by citizens, and then we'll see what's coming through chat, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. I know Lisa has another obligation, a meeting at just before 7, and we will try to end promptly at 7, but we'll try to get through as many questions as possible. So panelists, be as concise as you can. I certainly don't mind if multiple folks want to chime in on a question, but if we don't need everybody to chime in on every question if that's not appropriate. So right off the bat, I'm going to maybe call out Shelly because we did have a question about health equity, which I know that your team has worked on. The question is, what about health equity? Are the impacts of climate change felt and shared equally, or are there social influences that can raise or lower someone's risk to these health impacts? Kind of connects to what you were talking about earlier.
Yes, no, there are absolutely impacts of climate change that are going to have a disparate impact and widen our equity gaps that already exist in our community. And so certain groups that are going to be impacted by some of the things that I talked about earlier include very young children, infants, those under age 5, pregnant women, youth, school-aged youth, people with underlying health conditions, the elderly, those with behavioral health issues, those that are without housing. Right now, we have over 1,600 that we know of without housing in our community. Those that live in urban areas that might be affected by things like sea level rise, those that live in our rural communities who may not have access to certain services and may be more reliant on things like well water or septic tanks for their basic sanitation that can be impacted by things like flooding, extreme weather events, things of that nature. Our agricultural workers, those that work outdoors, these are going to be people that are high risk and experiencing severe health impacts due to climate change. The example that I gave earlier of the 6 Thurston County residents that lost their lives due to the hazardous weather heat event, all of those were people that already had other socioeconomic challenges. They lived in RVs, mobile homes. They did not have housing. They could not access things like air conditioning to be safe, or they didn't have transportation to get somewhere. So we're going to see more things like that happening. And it's critically important that we build equity and look at climate change through an equity lens in our community and do everything we can to protect our most vulnerable populations from the inevitable and current things that are happening right now.
Thank you, Shelly. The next question, I've got a question coming in that also was doubled by one that came in before. So it's obviously a topic that is of great interest. And I think it might be a Lisa question, I'm guessing. This is about sea level rise and what's the current plan to prevent potential flooding of Olympia's downtown waterfront, and more generally how sea level rise connects to climate change, and how is that being addressed?
Well, first off, Olympia has gotten together with the port, the water treatment group lot, and came up with a sea level rise plan. And in a similar pathway that the climate mitigation plan went through, they are currently into the process of how do we implement the sea level rise plan. We do need to get the state involved, because some of the land impacted is going to be state-owned land around Capitol Lake or whatever the EIS ends up with the option. We're going to need to have the state involved with that as well. Olympia and the coastline of the South Puget Sound is primarily going to be impacted with king tides. And those are tides that most people associate with maybe once or twice a year in the winter, where all of a sudden we're way above the normal high tide foot of about 16 feet. We're looking at 17 feet. And that will cause the water to surge over into the streets or back in through our storm drains. Part of our process and our early steps for sea level rise is to put floodgates into most of these outflow areas. All of those have actually been currently put in place. We are going to intentionally design berms and other I guess you should say earthen parks and streets and other physical options that are going to help redirect the water out of downtown. We are going to have to worry about subsidence in the peninsula that does have lot on it, as well as the port and some of the downtown. But that's going to be years down the line. We're also going to have to look at whatever the EIS option for the Capitol Lake comes up with, what that's going to do, say, for example, if the estuary is chosen or the hybrid option is chosen, what does that look like farther up the Deschutes mouth towards Tumwater and Tumwater Falls? And we are going to have to bring that in. And we're probably going to have to intentionally design some parkland that raises up the level so that we can prevent what may be upwards of 100 king tides per year by 2050. That's what we're looking at. So downtown could be flooded theoretically once a week for a couple hours a day. So we're going to have to do that. And the city of Olympia has already worked on the codes for any new buildings have to be set at 24 inches above what we figure will be the high water tide for some of these king tides. And we may have to look further because right now we're assuming somewhere between 12 inches and 24-inch increase in our high tides. And that's pretty significant for the downtown areas. It's also why the plan for building around South Puget Sound is requiring that people don't build within 50 feet of mean high unless they have mechanisms to prevent flooding. And that's it in a nutshell. It is an ongoing process. We're in the midst of putting together governance and funding for the sea level rise plan.
Good. Yes, there have been presentations on this to the community, and there's opportunities to kind of look at it's been a separate planning process from Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan, but it absolutely connects. So I appreciate the question. The next question, I think this is a great one for folks to understand. How will the success or failure of strategies outlined in the plan be measured? And I smile because Lisa and I are, knee deep in trying to figure that out with Allison and the other members of the Climate Action Steering Committee. But I don't know if Allison or Lisa probably be the best ones to describe kind of what we're trying to do on that piece.
I could take a start at it, and others can chime in because I think there's a lot of different ways to measure success. The easiest way, or I don't know about easiest, but one, maybe the simplest way, is that our region has set greenhouse gas reduction targets to reduce emissions 85% by 2050. And we have a way of there's a protocol out there that folks in our community have used in the past to kind of estimate what are our contributions, our local contributions of greenhouse gas emissions. And so, we can look at how those change over time in response to the actions we're taking. So at a basic level, we're going to be tracking to see how well we're hitting those targets. A thing that I think, we'll be talking about, and this is a conversation we're having as part of the planning work we're doing now, is one thing about those targets is that they kind of lag. It takes a couple of years to get that greenhouse gas information. And we want sort of the sub-information, like how well are we doing on our actions that we've identified in the plan? How much are people reducing the amount that they drive? How much are people reducing the amount of energy that they use? How much are we building out our local food network? All these kinds of things. And so there are other we might want to think about those sub-targets. How well are we distributing the costs and benefits of climate mitigation activities across vulnerable communities to make sure that they're not overly impacted, and that they're benefiting from the kind of climate work that we're doing. So there's other kinds of measurements that we may want to think about in addition to greenhouse gas emissions when we're defining what we mean by success.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Defining success for our region, I think, Allison, you did an excellent job. One of the things I just wanted to jump in is the steering committee has been talking about how do we transmit our metrics to the community, because we need to show that, one, the actions that the jurisdictions are doing are actually having an impact, but the actions of the community. And some of the dashboards we've been looking at, and the one that I particularly like, if you want to go look at it, is out of Fort Collins, Colorado. It's easy to see the different actions and whether we've actually completed them, if there's a greenhouse gas impact, a climate equity impact. I'm hoping that one of the outcomes in the next few meetings is for us to kind of land on what does the dashboard look like for the ongoing monitoring of our success or failure. Hopefully it's success, but we have a lot of work to do, and we only have 9 years until we get to our first all stated goals of 2030, and we've only been going up in the greenhouse gas area. So we're going to need the community to help us on this one.
And I'll just throw in that it's going back to my beginning, you've heard of phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. We're in phase 3, and that this is exactly what we're trying to dial up, is what is the long-term monitoring system going to look like, so that what are we going to report to the community, and how often, et cetera. So that work is going on right as we speak. Had an interesting question here about, is there anything included in the climate mitigation plan about waste reduction? And I know there is, and Allison just nodded. Can you maybe kind of touch on that, Allison?
Yeah, we do have a section that's on waste. One thing I'll note, and because people kind of ask about this, is that the climate mitigation plan, the targets we have, as I mentioned, they're based on an inventory of our greenhouse gas emissions. And that inventory is based on our things that happen within the county. And so it does not include, we don't have a good measurement right now. And I just want to caveat this because people sometimes think about this, are what are called consumptive side emissions. So the emissions that might be for a product that somebody purchases in Thurston County, but is manufactured somewhere else, that's not accounted for. We're just sort of measuring transportation that's happening within the county. So things like if you go up to SeaTac and you fly somewhere, those emissions are not accounted. We're just really looking at emissions within our border. That all said, we do have an action in the plan to ask that question broader, what are our consumption side emissions? And we do have things that are related to waste, both looking at the emissions from wastewater treatment on that side, but I suspect this question is more around solid waste. So, we have a strategy focused on what can we do to divert more solid waste from landfills? How can we bring down the amount of waste that we're contributing? Some of that is by looking at, working with different businesses and different partners to provide education, doing waste audits on what could they do to reduce waste. We also have kind of a focus in the plan and action around an existing program at Thurston County, the Waste Less Food program. So one of our biggest sources of waste that we think we can shrink down a lot is from food waste. So reducing food waste is an area of focus for us. I think it's also, there's a lot of interest in finding ways to use waste to generate energy. And that is something that actually is happening right now at the landfill, where all of Thurston County's waste ends up, the Roosevelt landfill. There's a lot of pretty innovative work going on to capture and use the waste there as an energy source that goes back into, for example, Puget Sound Energy's grid.
Okay, great. Thank you. This one just came in. Someone mentioned power ratings. Can they elaborate? I don't know if that was Jenica, you mentioned that, or Lisa. Lisa, go ahead if you have any response.
I'm assuming power ratings on buildings. Would that be a good assumption?
I think so.
Okay. Well, there was a work group put together by Thurston Climate Action Team, and several of us who are on the steering committee were also participating in this on how do we get for residential buildings an energy rating at the time of listing. We did come up with a shared set of goals, and I give a lot of credit to Thurston Climate Action Team and the electeds that were on the steering committee, because we had stakeholders from the building community, real estate associations, brokers, and a variety of other folks that would be directly impacted by such a rating system. And currently right now, and it was agreed upon, if we did these goals, we would do it regionally simultaneously. So currently right now, the climate program manager for Olympia is working on a model ordinance and a process, because somebody has to regulate this. Somebody has to ensure that the energy ratings at the time of listings for the buildings are actually being reported. We also have to train people how to do this, but that's a job generator. We hope it also is a job generator that as you get an energy efficiency rating, just like when you used to go buy a car and go, oh, it's 30 miles to the gallon. We're hoping the building is kilowatts per hour. And if you do this in the energy audits, you can reduce that, which will reduce your price. We're hoping this will also be an economy generator for people coming in and doing the retrofits to the buildings that are currently in there. So look into the future. It's going to take a little bit of time. There's a lot of nuts and bolts to put into our global goals that were fairly easy to actually develop. And now it's putting it together. Who's going to regulate it? Who's going to do it? Who's going to train the auditors? And then how do we make sure that's listed across the county? Is that what we were asking potentially, Ty, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you, Lisa. Appreciate it. This is a question I really like. It's something that I think probably a lot of people that aren't knee deep in this issue, probably ask themselves, hearing kind of what we're doing and all the work that's gone in here in Thurston County. The question is this: climate change is a global problem affecting the whole of the planet in different countries. How do local plans like ours to address climate change help mitigate the global impacts of climate change? How does our work fit into? It's a big question, but it's one that Lisa, I know you had an answer to that one.
I don't mean to hog.
No,
if Jenica or Shelly or Allison. Well, I'm gonna go back to the Paris Accords in 2015 when it was called the Global Covenant of Mayors. And the philosophy was that if every city in the world adopted a climate mitigation plan, a climate plan to reduce their greenhouse gases, their carbon footprint, this would be a huge step in the right direction. So I think Tip O'Neill, one of our own Washington politicians, said all politics are local. If we can lead the state has not yet even declared a climate emergency, even with the governor we have, who says climate is one of his major goals and climate mitigation for the state of Washington. As a local jurisdictions, if each local jurisdiction in the state of Washington, in the state of Oregon and California owned climate mitigation, we will make more headway than a single bill out of Congress or the Senate. We do need the help with our state legislations, but each group, each community doesn't buy tomatoes from California, so we're not shipping them up here. Maybe we buy the local ones, and when it's not tomato time of the year, we go to a different kind of vegetable. So yes, I think we can all have a collective effect on the climate, and we can come together as regions and also force the state and federal governments to do more than they are doing, because guess what? The people are already doing it, they're demanding it, and regions like Thurston County are already ahead of the game compared to a lot of the rest. And we can be the leaders in our state, because if every county in the state of Washington does this, then the whole carbon footprint of Washington goes down.
Thank you, Lisa. I like to just think about how the strategies that we're employing, they cross over to other areas and have other collateral benefits. I work in the salmon recovery world. I represent South Sound watersheds in salmon recovery policy, and one of the most dangerous things for our salmon are rising temperatures in streams, and that relates to forestry practice, relates to climate change, it relates to so many different things. So the strategies cross over and create multiple benefits, and so that's something to also keep in mind. We're getting really close here. We've just got probably time for one more question, and Lisa, we know that you have to go, so feel free to do that when you need to do that. We are going to end at 7. I'm going to try to get another question in though before we do, and we'll finish another kind of big one, because this panel, I hope everybody's enjoyed it. It's really aimed at an audience that maybe hasn't engaged with this issue as much, and so we're hopeful that we can give some information and background on what the region is doing. This is another question, kind of a big one. Doing nothing about climate change isn't obviously an option, but how do we weigh the necessity of clean energy and climate smart solutions with the ability for people, commerce, and the economy to adjust quickly enough to meet the goals? You know, the impacts of the changes versus the impacts of not acting quickly. How do we balance those considerations? Any thoughts on that? Lisa.
I will just, I'll leave this because yes, I do have to leave. I'll be short. That's an excellent question because we have people's livelihoods, their jobs to worry about, but we're also coming out of a COVID economy. We could marry that together. We have a unique opportunity to actually affect our economy and affect our communities in ways that we have never been able to have. Part of our climate mitigation plan was virtually working. This was before the pandemic. We now know virtually working can happen. We're now talking about how do we get people back to work? How do we get small businesses back to work? How do we get people trained in trades? Well, let's do the green trades. We talked about energy audits at the time of listing. There's another job. There's jobs if we can train people up in trades that will directly help our climate mitigation plan. So we are in a unique point of time that, 2 years ago, we wouldn't have expected to be there. Will it be difficult? Absolutely. But I think there is an opportunity here we should take advantage of.
Thank you, Lisa. And one of the questions that came in that I didn't ask specifically, because I thought Jenica kind of covered it, was what climate action job opportunities will be new in Thurston County in the next few years. I think Jenica kind of hit on that. And Lisa, you just kind of doubled up on that. I think that kind of covers that. I'd really like to thank everybody for participating. I'd like to thank the audience for attending. This will be available later on the Thurston County YouTube channel. If you want to learn more about what we're doing, if this has piqued your interest, we have Climate Action Steering Committee meetings, 4th Mondays of the month. Is that right, Allison? And they're available through Zoom. So you can plug in and find out more about the specifics of what we're working on. And again, as I said, more information on the Climate Mitigation Plan is available on the Thurston Regional Planning Council website, trpc.org. Thank you so much to my panelists. Thank you so much to all of you. We're going to keep working on this. We appreciate your time this evening.